got barbecue back there, and you didn't invite me. Hurt my feelings.
What is good? Welcome back to another Destination Dynasty Quick Hit episode. This is going to be a multi-part series talking through NFL draft trends, your draft picks in your Dynasty leagues. What are they worth? What do I do with them? How do I understand, based on the war in my league, if this class makes sense for me to invest in, where it makes sense for me to buy, sell in certain pick ranges? And we're going to go through and try to figure out what is the war on a draft pick and compare that to your individual league. Hopefully you can go through this same exercise using the war tool, ddfantasyfootball.com. Sign up with the link in the description, get 50% off the first month, and join the best community out there in Dynasty Fantasy Football. As you see on the screen, NFL draft players over the last 5 years. What does this look like? And what I did is I went through the last 5 years and just looked at where does the NFL draft skill players. So as you see, you have categories very low, low, medium, medium plus, high, and very high. And just looking at what rounds does the NFL draft typically produce for each skill player. So as you can see, if you just go through real quick, quarterbacks, the majority of quarterbacks go in round one. So now you can compare that to this year's class, which we'll look at here in just a second. But quarterbacks generally are getting drafted in round one. And then if they don't go in round one, what do you notice? They don't really go in round two. There's only been a couple over the last 5 years. Teams then use mid-round picks on a quarterback, but we're probably looking at the first-round quarterbacks being guys we would classify as what? Starters, right? And then the round 3, 4, 5 guys, which is the most popular rounds for teams to take, I don't know, a developmental or backup quarterback. Now, there's always a couple times where a third, fourth, fifth round quarterback will just fall into opportunity. We've seen that more often with NFL teams that don't have a quarterback. Instead of reaching, like we could see this year, I'll just take one in round 3. I'll just take one in round 4. And maybe I give them a shot for a year because I don't have any other options, right? That was Aiden O'Connell. That was Davis Mills. If you think of guys in that range, sometimes they just luck into a year of a starting job or 8 games of a starting job, or they at least get a look from the team of what's the worst thing that can happen. We don't have any better options, so let's just take a guy, and maybe they become Russell Wilson, Dak Prescott, Brock Purdy. Who knows? It's a long shot, but it's better to try that, and as you see teams, historically, that's where they take them. You don't see round 2 quarterbacks. So when you hear mocks and go, oh, this team's going to trade into the second to get this quarterback, or this team's going to wait and just take a quarterback in the second, historically, trends say that's probably not likely. Let's look at running backs. Running backs from a dynasty perspective. Keep this in mind. Now, this is a great running back class. We haven't had a great running back class. Maybe 2020 was supposed to be one. 2023 was pretty good, but we haven't had a running back class like this in a while. But historically, look at where the NFL drafts running backs. It's rare to see one in round 1. We might get 1 or 2 this year. Probably we'll get at least 1, maybe 2. Then you see a couple go in round 2 and round 3. We would probably take those guys that go in round 2 and round 3 as a little bit more of a expectation early for those guys. If a team drafts a round 2 running back and it's a pretty good profile, you're probably thinking, okay, I can probably put that player in a little bit of a higher tier. And what do we have this year? We have probably 5 running backs that most people have in a higher tier, which tracks with what the NFL has done historically. Now, this says probably a couple more guys will fall into round 3, but you can miss me with the mocks that say, 12 running backs are going to go day 2. It might happen, but the odds are against it. It's probably more like 8, 9 in this class. Even if this class is great, the historical average for running backs on day 2 or higher, 6. So if we get 8 or 9 here, that would be a huge win for this class. But then look at round 4, 5, and 6. That's where teams take running backs. Those are the most popular rounds to take running backs, and there's going to be a bevy of options. So keep that in mind, but also still understand that even if this class is great, it doesn't mean we're going to see. I mean, I've heard people say there's 15 day 2 or better running back draft grades. I mean, I'll believe that when I see it. It doesn't mean it's going to come to fruition with the actual draft. Now let's look at receiver. This is where it's very interesting because we've had a lot of good receiver classes over the last couple of years. First and second round receivers. Generally, that's where teams get their receivers. And I only think that's going to continue with the trend of how much receivers cost and how bad receiver was in free agency this year. On average, 11 receivers going in the first 2 rounds. And then round 3, almost 5 more. So you're talking about 16 receivers that go on day 2 or higher. That's more than double the number of running backs. Yet when we start looking at some of the big boards and we look at rookie mock drafts, that number's more 1 of 1 or 50-50. We do a mock draft and we'll take as many running backs as we would receivers. And I think that's just based on profiles, some bias with this class. And we'll talk about the equity in future shows about why it makes sense to kind of ignore draft capital after certain ranges. But for me, receivers, round 1 receivers obviously are very, very strong. Some round 2 receivers can be very hit or miss depending on their landing spots. But then you start looking at, there's a lot of receivers that are going to be drafted. As you can see in the far right-hand corner column, only about 19.6 running backs drafted over the last 5 years, 33.2 receivers. So there's going to be a ton of receivers drafted, but a lot of those come round 4, round 5, round 6, round 7, even round 3. And a lot of those guys for fantasy, I'll just say this, and when we get into the positional war, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. If you're drafting a receiver that went in round 3 or later, you better have a narrative. You better have a plan. I'm not saying players can't be good from that range. Obviously, we've seen some outliers, right? We've seen Tank Dell. We've seen Puka. We've seen Amon-Ra St. Brown. I'm not saying they can't produce from that range or they can't even get to a point where they have high value. But you better have a plan. Because you can think back and tell me, ooh, I was in on Terry McLaurin. I was in on Deontay Johnson. I was in on Puka and Tank Dell and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Well, look at the numbers, though. Look how many receivers on average go round 3 to round 7. And go look up the number of busts or players that just were never even relevant. You couldn't even sell for anything. Go back and look at last year's class, round 3 and later. Touting Jalen McMillan, I loved him. Look at everybody else. That's what a typical receiver class looks like. Now let's look at tight ends. Tight ends, it's rare to see a round 1 tight end. Probably get 2 this year. Okay. It's rare to see a round 2 tight end. Not a lot of teams take tight ends in round 2, similar to quarterbacks. So this idea that, again, we're going to see 5 tight ends go in the top 50 in the top 2 rounds. It's bucking historical trends. Round 3, it starts to ramp up. Round 4, very popular for tight ends. So even though there's 6, 7, 8 tight ends people like in this class, the odds that all of them get draft capital that you're like, wheels up, heck yeah, I don't know. Look at these trends, right? Historically, only about 5 tight ends go in the first 3 rounds. Yet I've seen mocks that have 8 tight ends in 3 rounds. Something's got to give. Total number of skill players, it's about 77.8, so call it 78. So right there, if you just think about your rookie drafts, most rookie drafts are 4 rounds. So if it's a 12-team league, you're talking about 48 picks in your rookie draft, 78 skill players drafted. So it's just interesting to put kind of numbers to this, but it really stuck out to me when I looked up these numbers and then started to look at actual drafts, actual mock drafts, actual big boards, etc. So let's go ahead and switch over to that. So I use Mock Draft Database. You can sign up for it. It's free, really good website that really just aggregates mock drafts. So we're not even saying that this is what's going to happen, but if you're taking the aggregate of a ton of mock drafts and they use team mocks, first round mocks, and then big boards where teams or people really have a big board for the entire draft, it gives you some pretty good data and trends. I mean, JJ Zacharyson has talked about using this in his model in place of draft capital because really draft capital, yes, it will change for some players, but the majority, if you just plug this in and you're using draft capital as part of your model, you can take this as pretty accurate even before the draft actually happens. Just take a look at the positions and look at it relative to what I was just talking about. So let's look at quarterbacks. So this year's quarterbacks, I'll just show, I mean, really what we're looking at is the first 3 rounds, first 4 rounds. And this is if you're playing the any quarterback on a 2-deep strategy like I like to. Here's really what you're interested in. So Cam Ward, Shedeur Sanders, and then a couple guys in round 2. So right there, what did I already say? It's rare to see a round 2 quarterback. Not saying it can't happen, but the fact that we have 2 of them in round 2 here, something's going to give. My bet is probably Jackson Dart moves way up. He might be the 36th player on your big board, but that's not how the NFL drafts quarterbacks. If Jackson Dart has one team that thinks he's worth a first, he's going in the first round. Just takes one team. Now you get to the other guys, Jalen Milroe, they have him here going mid-second, and then Quinn Ewers in the early third. Tyler Shuck has gotten a lot of buzz as a guy that could go in the second. Again, I'm betting maybe we get 1 second-round quarterback. But the odds are we're going to see this group right here, Milroe, Ewers, Shuck, Howard, maybe another guy, Gabriel, McCord. We're going to see the majority of those guys go round 3, round 4, round 5, meaning they are drafted to be backups, but you can pick and choose. I mean, there's a couple teams out there that don't even have a backup. You know, the Ravens, the Vikings, the Cowboys. You know, there's teams that don't have a backup quarterback. So if they took one of these guys and you're playing the any quarterback on a 2-deep strategy, okay, I can get on board. Again, you're not drafting these guys to be your starter, but there could be opportunity. And at worst, man, you're not going to probably see a guy like Will Howard or Tyler Shuck or Quinn Ewers. If they get drafted in the 3rd round to a team like Minnesota or Dallas, like they're not going to go to like the 4th round of your rookie draft. So it's a cheap way to get the acquisition of the any quarterbacks on a 2-deep with guys that have some contingency potential. It's like Spencer Rattler last year. Yes, he was behind Derek Carr, so that drove his value up a little bit, but he got opportunity. And if he gets opportunity because he has a name, because he had decent draft capital, there might be a chance to maybe move a little bit. Let's look at the running backs now. Remember the trend, and I'll flash it back up so everybody can see. Remember the running back trend. 1 running back in round 1 on average, and then 5 in round 2 and round 3. So this magic day 2 draft capital that we hear about, and then you hear about how many good running backs are in this class. Let's take a look. So here we go. Running backs. Obviously got Genty high. Hampton's moved up on big board aggregate into the 1st round. But then let's look at everything else. Henderson in the 2nd. Judkins in the 2nd. Okay. I can get on board with those 2 going in the 2nd. I think that's probably right. The first 4 guys go off the board in the first 50, 60 picks. So you're talking first 2 rounds for the first 4 running backs. That's fair. And you got Caleb Johnson in the early 3rd. I think depending on the fit, he could easily go in the 2nd, but he could fall to the 3rd. And I don't think it really matters. It probably matters a lot more in terms of if he goes pick 60 or pick 70. Technically, that's 2nd round capital and 3rd round capital, but it's probably much more about the fit and the landing spot that he goes to. Here's where it gets wonky. Scattaboo in the 3rd. Dylan Sampson in the 3rd. Chutin in the 3rd. So right there, we're at 8. Then we have all of these guys crunched up. Giddens, Gordon, Neal, Harvey, Etienne, all in the 4th. Martinez, Smith, Blue, Monungai, Sanders, Jarquez Hunter, Donovan Edwards, LeQuint Allen, all these guys in the 5th. And then all the way down to, I believe the last pick is 254. So it's probably right on this range where it cuts off in terms of how many running backs get drafted. And what do you notice? If you count these 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 26 running backs on the big board. Average, 19.6. So it'll just be very interesting. If this is a strong running back class, I do suspect you will get more running backs drafted in total. But what's going to be very interesting is how many hit that premier capital range that we usually cite as day 2 draft capital. Whether you believe it or not, I'm of the mindset, and Ray's talked about this a lot. Him and I have had tons of conversations about where's that cutoff. Really, once you get out of round 2, early round 3, maybe it's even late round 2 and further back. It is all about the depth chart and the landing spot. So it's just going to be very interesting looking at these historical trends, how the NFL actually reacts to this running back class. Let's take a look at the receivers. So receivers, remember, it was very, very top heavy. With the demand for receivers in the NFL, 16 receivers on average going on day 2 or higher. And it was about 11 in the first 2 rounds and then another 16 in the first 3 rounds. Let's count. So here, the average, remind everybody, average 5.6 in the first round. Obviously, we're not going to get close to that this year. Over-unders 3.5. Big boards here have 4. McMillan, Golden, Egbuka, and Burden. Now, Hunter's a wild card. So Travis Hunter being drafted, I think if the Browns take him, they view him as a receiver. If he falls a little bit and a team takes him, maybe that means they're going to use him only at receiver. But if he goes high and he doesn't go to the Browns, is he going to be classified as a receiver? So he's a wild card. He almost doesn't count as one. But for purposes of rookie drafts, he's obviously going to be somebody that people take with a rookie pick in the first 10, 15 picks, depending on his landing spot. But he's going to count as a receiver. So you can almost add one, which puts us a little closer to that average of the 5.5. But then looks at round 2. Iamaner, Harris, Higgins. That's it. So even if you count Travis Hunter, only 8 in the first 2 rounds, which kind of tracks with the track of this class being a weaker receiver class. Let's go to round 3. Beck, Knoll, Bond, Royals, Restrepo, Savion Williams, Tez Johnson. So right there, that's 7 more in round 3. That still only puts us at 12, which is way below the historic trends. So does that mean something about supply and demand? And is a couple of these guys going to go higher? Do we see more receivers get pushed up this year in lieu of running backs? And how do you track a running back prospect? Let's say Devin Neal. Go look at where Devin Neal was mocked on the big boards. 124. So you're putting Devin Neal in round 4 and then going back to receivers. And let's say Devin Neal is running back 9 off the board, running back 10 off the board in round 4. But then you have Jack Beck gets pushed up, or Jack Besh gets pushed up into the 2nd round. How do you determine where to go? When we get to the war, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. But it's going to be very interesting if the NFL pushes receivers up this year based on historical trends and also based on the demand that guys like Josh Palmer, Diami Brown. I mean, look at the contracts, Darius Slayton. Look at the contracts those guys are getting. They're getting the same contract that you would pay for a good defensive tackle starter or a good linebacker or a good corner. And there's going to be plenty of those that get drafted earlier than some of these receivers. So it's going to be interesting how the NFL treats that. Now let's go to tight ends. Won't spend a ton of time on tight ends, but I wanted to remind everybody, look at this. So it's rare to see a first-round tight end. When we get one, though, it's pretty good. We'll talk about that on a future episode with draft pick war and historical tight end war, depending on where they're drafted. But it's rare to see tight ends go in the first 2 rounds, right? Only 1.8 over the last 5 years. So on average, that's 9 tight ends over the last 5 years have gone in round 2. Only 3 have gone in round 1. But now let's look at this year's big board. So we have Warren and Loveland in the first. Okay. Mason Taylor, Elijah Arroyo in the 2nd. Okay. Historically, you're probably not seeing 4 tight ends go in the first 2 rounds. But this year, a lot of people have that happening. Then you have Harold Fannin in the 3rd, Gunnar Helm in the 3rd, and Terrence Ferguson at the beginning of the 4th. So right there, again, we're kind of bucking historic trends. It shows, is this tight end class better than average? Maybe. Then again, a month ago, before the combine, I heard that this was the best tight end class in a long time. And it's probably not. There's probably 7 or 8 tight ends you can be interested in, depending on what Gunnar Helm can do with his numbers. I think this probably holds. A lot of people buried him after the combine, but we'll see. But after these guys, after Ferguson, you're looking down here. Who else is interesting? Aronde Gadsden, maybe you like him. Luke Lachey, maybe you like him. Jake Breedstool, maybe you like him. There's going to be 1 or 2 more. But I look at this tight end classes. You're going to get a lot of non-fantasy relevant tight ends late, which tracks with the historic trends. So last thing, this is going to be a preview and a tease for the future episodes. We're almost 20 minutes in, but I want to just show this. So this is using the roster construction series. And it's probably better that I show this first because this will be a little more helpful. Looking at the roster construction series. So this is Superflex, 12 teams, start 11, 1.75 tight end premium. This is the 3-year war average. And if you haven't played with this, you can break this down. You can remove each position and see what each position looks like on the trend line. But I just wanted to put this up on the screen and show you this is what the NFL war distribution production looks like over a 3-year average in a 12 by 11, 1.75 tight end premium. Nothing else fancy. This is the distribution. So just look at this, and we'll come back to this in future episodes. Look at this, and then look at the historic war for draft picks. And I'm just going to leave this here. It's obviously both a similar slope downwards as you get further. Of course it is. But there's a real clear delineation as to this graph compared to the war graph. And we're going to talk about that in future episodes, going through each position, kind of looking at what that means for the value of your draft picks relative to this class. And this is just 2 rounds of historic war per game value for picks in this format. 12 by 11, 1.75 tight end premium. And as you can see, where there's some spots where maybe we overvalue and or undervalue picks, and we'll talk about it in future episodes, what to do at each position this year, depending on where you're picking. Like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. ddfantasyfootball.com. Link is in the description to try out the War Tool, the Trinity Tracker, and be a part of the best Dynasty community that is out there. Engage in the comments, and I look forward to part 2 and part 3 and however many it takes for me to get through this series. This is the stuff that I love. Hopefully you're there to join me, and hit me up in the comments. I'll get back to you. See you next episode. Be chill.